EUC.
Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Enabling Space, Voices of Civil Society Resilience, a podcast from the EUC, where, as you all know, we explore how civil society is navigating the rapidly changing environment we are experiencing across the world today. I am Clarisse, and as always, super thrilled to be with you all today. And it is Gender Justice Month, and we are on the heels of our webinar at CSW on women defending gender rights in deteriorating enabling environments, and recording just a short time after International Women's Rights Day, which is why this conversation is so timely and so crucial. You can learn more about the gender policy rollback and the anti-rights movement in the EUC's upcoming research paper that examines the drivers of anti-gender policies and also the counter strategies deployed by civil society. It is a pleasure to be joined today by Ilse Wermink, MenEngage Europe Director, and Florence Bateson, Gender, Peace and Security Expert. Hello, Florence, and hello, Ilse, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Clarice, great for having us. Thank you.
Hi, Clarice. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you so much for being a part of this podcast today. Could you maybe start, you, Ilse, and then Florence, by briefly introducing us to you, first of all, and then your work in civil society and experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. I'll start with something very personal. It's today the 8th birthday of my daughter. So I've just come from a school run.
Happy birthday to her.
Thank you. After 10 years of working for a Dutch peacebuilding organization called PAX, where in the most recent role I was focused on gender, peace, and security in the same way as Florence, I'll be taking up a new role as the MenEngage Europe Director from next week on. So this is exciting because I'll aim to speak from the perspective of MenEngage while I'm at the start of taking up the role.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I wish you, and our listeners, of course, I'm sure, wish you the very best in this new position.
And then to introduce myself, so my name is Florence. I've been working with Ilse for the past 7.5 years at PAX, also as a gender, peace and security expert. And we can go into a bit more detail later exactly what programs you're managing. And actually, I started my career in the Netherlands at Hivos. So I was working on sexual rights and diversity projects and digital security for human rights defenders at Hivos for a couple of years before moving to PAX. And I'm currently, and I wanted to mention this because I do think it's relevant for this conversation, I was made redundant along with half of the organization at the beginning of the year. And I think it's relevant to mention that because that is very much linked to the anti-rights movement and the anti-gender backlash that we will be talking about today. The global cuts to development funding that we've seen over the world, most notably in the US last year with US aid cuts, but the Netherlands also hasn't been immune to that. And obviously those that suffer the most are the partners that we work with in country, but also another symptom of that has been mass redundance across the country within our sector. So I did want to mention that because I do think it's relevant for this conversation.
Yes,
and I'm very happy to be here today.
I'm super happy to have you and to have you as well, Ilse. And I hope that you back at home are going to learn something from this conversation. And about the US aid cuts that Florence just mentioned, you might want to check out the EUC website to see a research that was carried out sometime last year on the devastating consequences of these funding cuts, like Florence was just mentioning. Now, we've just seen for the first time in history at CSW that their outcomes were not adopted by consensus, with the United States voting against. Some are seeing this as an alarming consequence of the rise of the anti-rights, anti-gender movement. In your own words, any of you who feels like you're feeling this question, what is the anti-rights movement and what is the gender policy rollback phenomenon?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first, Florence. And maybe to link up with what you were saying, Clarice, on CSW, I've been involved in the recent years, both during CSW weeks as well as the Women, Peace, Security Week in October. And we've really seen a change of the political space that is there, as well as the realities of hosting the UN in New York. So I think what we are seeing, if we look at the anti-rights movement, is both a global movement and one that is hyper-local in how it plays out, with all the specific elements that form that. I think when we look at it from a minority world, global north perspective, it's one in which we see a coalition, one that is not always as likely as you think, between kind of far right, nationalist, white supremacist groups and country leadership currently in multiple countries, and religious fundamentalist groups. So we see kind of very fundamentalist Christian groups, particularly from the US and their influence in Europe. And I think for this podcast, I'd be very comfortable to talk from a Dutch perspective and a European perspective, also to really recognize and signify the learning that we have to do. And I think if I'm looking at the Netherlands in the last 2 years, we've seen a governance which is far right for the first time in many a lifetime in the Netherlands. So that meant it was in a way a shock to the system to see, right, now we are dealing with what our partners have been dealing with for decades. So it's the turning of tables and it's the learning of lessons the other way around. But if you're asking me about an anti-rights movement from that perspective, that's very much to do with radical right meeting very fundamentalist Christian values. I think for the majority world, an anti-rights perspective has been there for far longer, is not a shock to the system as such, and is also very much to do with colonial histories and to do with religious fundamentalism as well as political opportunism. That would be the way I would frame it.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. And what about you, Florence? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just well, thanks, Ilse, for mentioning the more local perspectives, because I think it's easy when you work in an INGO to focus on the countries that you're working in and not to reflect actually on the context where you're working. And we'll speak a bit more in depth later in the conversation about the countries we have been working in, but I think also linking the anti-rights movement to the anti-gender backlash that's also prolific in the Netherlands, in the UK, in the US, and it's very much linked to this global anti-rights, anti-gender movement. If you see, for example, now very limited access to abortion rights in the US, also very much fueled by religious conservatism, religious extremism. You see in the Netherlands certain terminology being banned, and we can talk a bit further about that. You can see increased police brutality and police repression against activists in the Netherlands and the UK and the US, and in fact all over the majority world global north, especially since the genocide began in Gaza against pro-Palestinian Palestinian activists. I think that was seen, at least from my perspective, because I'm from the UK, most harshly in the UK against the Palestine Action Group that was labelled as a terrorist group. So you also see how governments and systems of power are not only fueling an anti-rights movement, but they're also instrumentalizing laws. They're tweaking legal systems to also benefit their own agenda. And you can also see that in Iraq and Lebanon, which we'll speak about later. But I think it goes beyond just repressing rights, but also instrumentalizing power against civil society, against people. And I think the global solidarity with Palestine since the Gaza genocide began is a very clear and visible example of how governments are implementing this anti-rights agenda. And of course, it applies to other movements, other groups of activists. But I think with the Palestinian repression, it's very visible to everybody.
Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing. And recent EUC research demonstrates that a number of countries are indeed experiencing a reversal of previously established gender policies, indicating an emerging trend. For example, in Paraguay, we've seen a ministerial resolution to remove the word gender from educational materials. And in Peru, their Congress approved a law to eliminate gender equality. And also in Trinidad and Tobago, Senegal, and even Liberia, we've seen an increase in the criminalization of homosexuality. What are some of the gender policy rollback trends that you've observed in recent years from your work?
Just to say, Clarice, also when looking at it from an international perspective, the ways in which anti-gender backlash and gender rollback happens is something that's very strategic, something that's very much part of long-term planning, heavily funded, and internationally coordinated in the long term. So I think that's something that we really need to recognize. Also, when we're thinking of CSW, for example, or other policy spaces, it's very crucial for patriarchal authoritarian leaders, such as Trump, such as Putin, such as others that we know across the world, to actually include and center anti-gender politics as part of the way that they reason, in the part of the way that they misinform, and part of the way in which they mobilize. And what we see directly coming into war rhetorics and the ways that certain countries are being attacked and the ways that they want to mobilize fighting power inside their countries. Saying that, I think what you're describing, Clarice, in Paraguay actually hit home with me in recent years in the Netherlands. So when we saw a far-right cabinet take power in the Netherlands against many expectation, it became something that was actually a day-to-day reality. So I was then working, apologies, as a gender peace security advisor, working in coalition with an organization called the Women Equals Men gender platform. And what we saw happening was that the language that was being used, the anti-gender language, the language that was very binary, that was very much against transgender individuals, was something that was becoming very much part of the political environment, the media environment, and was led by a Party for Freedom in the Netherlands. So I think in that, I just wanted to really share some personal experiences, which signify that this is something that isn't happening in non-Western countries in the majority world, but very much something that we're seeing in the Netherlands and have seen in the Netherlands, but also very much something we face in Europe. As MenEngage, backlash is seen as a prevailing context, is the reality that we work in, is something in which we're building coalitions at a European level to inform each other, to keep each other, to connect, and as a strategy to work against and to really find ways to get political allies. But in my personal experience in the last 2 years of a really dysfunctional far-right government, was situations where you're being invited to a closed-door policy discussion on security and stability, and you're being invited, but at the same time you're being told, don't use the word gender. And you see in documents that a minister from a far-right party would effectively be taking out the word gender across. So they want to talk about equality, not gender equality. They want to talk about women and men, not gender. So this is where you see in only a few weeks' time already direct loss of language. And it's actually something which was very telling to me, that while I was working together with Florence, and Florence will tell you much more about it, in Iraq, in Syria, across the Southwest Asia region, we were seeing a very, very strongly coordinated, systematic anti-gender backlash. I was facing it personally, and it was something where we were talking amongst ourselves and saying, to what extent do we go along? Because you want that access to be able to have influence, but at the same time, you also want to stand your grounds. And it was very interesting how little experience we actually had inside the Netherlands to do this. I think if we look at Europe, and we look at Hungary, we look at Slovakia, Poland, the shifts that are happening in Italy, the language that is used by leaders of reform in the UK, of Marine Le Pen in France, it's very, very clear that far-right politics is directly connected to anti-gender politics, and in which gender stereotyping is a strategy in and of itself, is something in which particularly young men are reached, that are disgruntled, that are not finding themselves heard and seen, and not finding their space in societies that are deeply patriarchal still. Yeah, so I think if I'm talking about anti-gender backlash and how that's taking shape, it's something that actually hit us in the Netherlands without enough preparation, and working with partners in countries where there's much more experience with it was so helpful.
Wow. And it is indeed new information to me that this is also happening in your country, Ilse. I mean, some of these things are not, I don't know, it's not something you can imagine. when you come from a majority country. I know in my context that homosexuality, same-sex marriage, anything that concerns transgenderism is strictly prohibited, and you can actually get locked up if you are even suspected of practicing any of those. I don't know how that is proven in a real court, but it is actually very enriching to hear how this is being manifested in other contexts as well. And Florence, you had wanted to share also from your experience.
Yeah, just a couple of things to add on to what Ilse was saying. Also, just a couple of very personal experiences to maybe also demonstrate how this is in practice. There was one occasion last year from myself and then one of a colleague going into the ministry for closed-door meetings with parliamentarians for a lobby and advocacy tour with Iraqi activists. And I had on my laptop a sticker, and all it said was Free Palestine. And they have to scan all the things in your bag before you get into the parliament. And they saw this sticker, and immediately I had five of the security guards around me questioning me, why have you got this sticker on your laptop? They were really interrogating me, and eventually someone I was with was able to talk to them and they let me in. But for me, it was a very obvious incident of repression of free speech, actually. And I was saying Free Palestine, that shouldn't be something that's controversial. It's freeing a people from genocide. And then I think actually perhaps even more shocking, because we do see this narrative a lot in Dutch society. But a colleague of mine then went into the same ministry and she had a bag saying gender equality on, and she received the same treatment saying gender equality, which for me was perhaps even more shocking because I expected a bit with the Zionist discourse of the state. I was expecting it a bit more with the Free Palestine sticker, but gender equality I found really shocking. And then also just to add on a bit to what Ilse was saying about the far right movement and linking that to young men. I'm sure many of you and many of the listeners have seen the Netflix show called Adolescence. It was a UK-based film about a very raw depiction of how young boys, actually, I don't even think we can call them young men, teenage boys, are so vulnerable to being radicalized actually online in the so-called manosphere. And this is very linked to far-right politics. It's young men very much against the pro-trans movement, the pro-gender equality movement, the pro-women's rights movement, and it's trying to reclaim the space for quote-unquote real men. And they're very much, they're preying on vulnerable young boys that actually feel so lost in this world. They feel like they don't have a place because women and women activists and the women's movement for decades, centuries have provided different roles for women. We don't need men anymore, actually. We don't need men even to have babies. And men no longer fulfill these traditional roles of protector and provider. And my take on it is that they feel lost. They don't know then what their role is in the world. They feel vulnerable, and then they go onto these online spaces and they're radicalized by these very extremist men. Yeah, they call themselves men's rights groups. And these are really dangerous. And there's been also many documentaries, research now about the manosphere and how dangerous these groups are as well for the progression of, not actually just for the progression of gender equality, but for the regression of gender equality. They're also really contributing to the rollback of rights. And you can't also separate these groups from Trump's administration, from MAGA, from these far-right authoritarian groups. They're all interwebbed in a system of patriarchal and misogynist power across the globe. I think it's a very frightening time, actually. And I think it's good to focus more on these spaces and groups, because often when we talk about anti-gender backlash, anti-gender movements, we often talk about the impact of women and girls, which of course should be at the center of these conversations because they are the ones that are going to suffer. But if we want to tackle these issues, we really need to focus on these groups as well. But I think we'll talk about that a bit later on strategies of combating or countering the backlash.
And what you're saying, Florence, also makes me think that the media has a great role to play in all of this, right? Also, where the way that the media portrays women and portrays men, even in the most, neglectful of sins, it contributes a lot to the way that women are seen, to the way that other genders are seen, trans people and the rest are seen. Just like someone was mentioning a few days ago, the fact that in Kunta Kinte, the movie, a man has to be in a particular way. He has to be strong in a particular way. He doesn't have to cry. And the women are always portrayed, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, cooking or cleaning the yard or taking care of babies and the rest. It contributes to this idea in general that is what women are reduced to. That is what they should be doing all the time, and this is how men should be. And then it propagates this idea of what I like to call toxic masculinity, which I think is something that has to be looked at deeper, because the media has such a giant role to play. And Ilse, you were mentioning that you have experience working in significant contexts such as Iraq, Southwest Asia, and Lebanon. What are some of the unique challenges faced in those environments when looking to secure justice for women and girls and promote gender equality?
Thanks, Clarice. I think it'd be very comfortable for Florence to take a first bite at the question, because she's been much more directly involved in the region. So please go ahead, Florence, and I'll add on.
Sure.
Yeah, I can start with Iraq. I've been working in Iraq most closely the past, 7 years or so. So to give a bit of context, Ilse and I were managing a program called Al Fawda Untha, which it translates from Arabic into English as The Revolution is Female. And we were working in Sudan and Iraq, and I was managing the Iraq part of the program. And I'm going to give a bit of context to the program because I think it's then relevant to explain a bit the anti-gender backlash, which really escalated in 2023. So the program in Iraq, excuse me, it began in 2020, and it was building on I don't want to say unprecedented role of women in the revolution in 2019, because there has been a really strong women's movement in Iraq for a long time before. But in the 2019 revolution, which was a nationwide revolution in Iraq with activists from all walks of life, protesting against government corruption, lack of services, lack of employment, etc. And in these demonstrations, there were women from different generations, whereas previously it's been one generation of women, more elite feminist activists. But in this particular revolution, the reason, people say it was an unprecedented role of women, because there was really women from cities, women from more rural areas, women from different ages, different education levels, different religions, etc., etc. And they played not just often we see in revolutions that women activists play a more supportive role in terms of providing food for the activists, medical care, etc. And that was a bit how the participation began in the Tishreen movement in Iraq. But then it really evolved to women activists taking a leading role in feminist organizing and organizing their own protests, hosting their own feminist tents, educating themselves, etc. So we tried to, on this program, work with Iraqi-based partners to build on this, not even just role that women played, but they kept the revolution alive, actually. So to work with these new generation of young women feminist activists and see how to bring that fire and energy that they had on the streets into more decision-making positions for more equality, etc., in the country. So the program ran for 5 years, and it was in 2023 that an anti-gender backlash became very apparent. As Ilse mentioned earlier, it's not just something that comes out of nowhere. It's very strategic, and it's been built over a number of years with a number of different actors. And I remember very clearly when it was, because I came off my maternity leave in August 2023, and then my first week back, it was it really escalated to quite a frightening extent, actually. So what happened in Iraq is there was a Telegram group, and it's difficult to say exactly who was behind it, but it's very much suspected that it was Iran-backed militias that were behind this Telegram group. And we saw very quickly that it was a very coordinated and strategic campaign, because on this group, which had huge, widespread support of tens of thousands of people within the country, they began very quickly targeting civil society, feminist civil society, pro-gender equality civil society on this group, listing specific organizations, listing specific individuals. And they were using the framing that these organizations were pro-LGBTQI plus rights, and equating, framing these organizations as promoting a Western agenda because they're pro-LGBTQ, and then accusing them of being against Iraqi national and religious values. This was a way to gain mass public support, especially from religious communities, which makes up the majority of Iraq. PACS, who I was working for while implementing this project, they were specifically targeted on this Telegram group, along with all the partners that we were working with and specific activists and other Dutch NGOs and many Iraqi-based organizations. So one clear incident was on Pride, we changed our logo at PACS to the rainbow flag, and that came under huge scrutiny in the Telegram group. Our staff came under quite severe risk, I can say, being associated with PACS. Other organizations we were working with, they received death threats, they received formal letters from the government asking them to stop their work. Activists were also receiving death threats, online harassment. We all, on the program, we had to completely stop all our activities. We had to go underground. We had to go back to all our posts since the beginning of the program on all our social media platforms. We had to take out anything that mentioned gender equality, women's empowerment, because these terms became banned very quickly after the backlash began. So the first term to be banned was gender equality, but then even women's empowerment became controversial to say. So then we had to say women's rights. That was the least dangerous term to use. We were banned from working in universities with students. There was a whole series of formal bans from the government that all NGOs were sent. It was a very difficult period for activists we work with. I think alongside the targeting of organizations, individuals, INGOs, there was also assassinations of women activists. There was a series of them throughout 2023 and 2024. And then most recently, also 2 weeks ago, there was another prominent activist called Yanar Mohammed. She was the founder of Alfi, Organization for Women's Freedom in Iraq. I believe Hivos actually worked with them previously. And she was responsible for setting up the first safe shelters in Iraq. And most recently, she was also hosting safe shelters for LGBTQI community. So they came under huge risk. But yeah, alongside these targets of individuals, organizations, etc., there was also a series of legal amendments that were made, and it links a bit to what you were saying earlier, Clarice. So there was the first one that happened was amendments to the anti-prostitution law, which on the first draft, it criminalized homosexuality by the death penalty, which was shocking, actually. And it didn't get into international news, I think wrongly so. It didn't get the attention it needed internationally, but there was a lot of closed-door lobbies between different international embassies in Iraq. And luckily, the death penalty was taken out of the amendment. However, it is still heavily criminalized to be in a homosexual relationship or to even know someone in a homosexual relationship. So if you're found to be in a homosexual relationship, the penalty is up to 15 years in prison. And if you know somebody in a homosexual relationship, it's 7 years in prison. So this was one very frightening legal regression. And another was to the personal statement law, which was approved last year. Again, the first amendments that proposed were a lot worse than what was finally ratified due to a lot of lobby and advocacy by women's activists and women's groups within Iraq themselves, which really also showed the power of the women's movement in Iraq. But it still has some frightening consequences. So previously, for example, marriage laws were just through the personal status law of 1959. So in the amendment, it also legalizes marriages under the Shia Jafari school of Islamic jurisprudence. And under this school, it does allow children as young as 9 to be married, specifically girls under the age of 9 to be married. So while in this amendment, this is a little bit confusing, in this amendment, it does state that the Jafari school cannot override the personal status law minimum age of marriage, which in the case of girls is 15. However, there's a loophole, and it legalizes unregistered marriages. And in Iraq, it was found that 22% of unregistered marriages involves girls under the age of 14. So that in a way, it's trying to mitigate that there's young girls married off, but there's this loophole of unregistered marriages, which means young girls are really at risk. And of course, young girls are being married off are at far bigger risk of sexual violence, economic isolation, etc., etc., etc. So this was another really frightening regression in the legal system related to the anti-gender backlash. So I just wanted to illustrate that it's really multifaceted, the anti-gender backlash in Iraq, and it's had, multifaceted impacts on different levels, from civil society to the law to individuals.
Thank you so much, Florence. And Ilse, maybe you want to share your own experience as well?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to. So in the same, while being a colleague of Florence, we were also working on a program called Strengthening Civil Courage in 14 countries. So this is a program which was really involved with different organizations as well, Defend Defenders, Amnesty International, and Abad, a Lebanese gender platform. What we saw was this rise of anti-rights movements, governance, of anti-gender backlash, gender rollback, as you were mentioning. And I think what Florence was describing was, in a way, a particular country case on which PAX was directly affected, our partners were directly affected. What we did was we started running shared learning sessions between partners in contexts that were facing similar challenges, and then actually did a research piece, a practice paper on what are now lessons learned of how do we deal with this. And as I said at the start, when I was starting to answer questions, Clarice, was we have a very global trend which plays out hyperlocal. That's something we saw as well, but I think things that Florence mentioned were lessons learned that came up in many different contexts. The strategic adaptation of language and approaches was one that came up regularly. There are different ways to phrase and continue to make your point, continue to take up civic society space, but to do it smartly. So that means you need to have a very good sense of where the debate can go and what places you in harm's way and what doesn't, and to be very strategic in your risk analysis and the willingness to take risk as an activist, and also have the capacities to fall back on different tactics and different options in a way for your safety. One, I think that Florence also personally was very much involved in Iraq, and which came up in all these different contexts. So we were speaking to feminist peace activists in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and in Iraq. Was the trickiness of diplomatic engagement and the involvement of diplomats. So it's good and bad and ugly, like the movie title. So it's really important to find ways to engage with diplomats and to have diplomats are increasingly aware of the realities of what is happening in governmental politics and policies and local authorities, and then working with them, really feeding them the best approaches to address it. Because too overly open engagements can actually create even stronger backlash, which is very dangerous to the lives of the individuals that they are in contact with. So there's a real responsibility there. While at the same time, like silent diplomacy and exerting pressures can be very helpful to ensure that there's a signaling towards authorities. This is not okay, this is not accepted, this will have repercussions, and we will strongly advise you to stop this particular targeting. And at the same time, diplomatic actors are in a position to fund safe houses, to share information, to inform also what their countries are doing in other fora. So if there is a UPR happening, a Universal Periodic Review, or when there's other moments in which they can actually bring this information in. I think one that came up a lot was, and this is where the hyperlocal comes in, the programming that is effective in continuing to pursue gender equality in increasing backlash is where it's very community-centered. So you start with what the community prioritizes, what the community needs, what the language is, the understanding that the community has, and you work at their pace. You work at the pace of trust in a way. So the ways that we, as an INGO, a neo-colonial system of aids cooperation has developed is often one quite stringent logical frameworks. We need to have milestones. We need to have X amount of years. This and this has to be achieved, and this is your budget. Where in reality, to prevent harm, to prevent further backlash, what we really need is really community rootedness, and this really came out. And I think it's interesting if I look at MenEngage and their kind of key lessons and the things that we found over those years of working in those contexts is a lot of overlap. So there is real overlap in the way that civil society organizations have started to strategically engage with religious and political actors, which in the grand majority are men. Men of ruling elites, men of elite power-holding identities. And in doing that, of course, there are very different approaches that can be taken. But I've been in spaces where people are talking to each other on how they do it. And it's actually really interesting what can happen if step by step, using the right language, using the right entry points, men in positions of power can be involved to actually really realize what is the harm that happens to their communities, to their societies, in this increasingly patriarchal reality. And I think this is something you mentioned yourself, Clarice. The media plays a role. I think in strategies, it comes back to creative communication and in doing two things. And there I go a little bit binary, where the reality is never binary. But in the one hand, we know Meta and social media provides platforms for the manosphere, for anti-rights movement, for misinformation, disinformation, direct targeting of human rights and feminist peace activists. Where on the other hand, it has also provided the platforms for counter narratives, for mobilizing, for coalition building. And this is where digital literacy, digital security, and ways in which organizations can support holding Meta and other social media companies to account is so crucial.
I just think also in the context of the Israeli and US war in the Southwest Asia region at the moment, it's difficult countering the anti-gender backlash specifically because it's a very strong narrative that governments in the region use, that feminism, gender equality are Western imported concepts, practices, etc. And then in the context of increased and very violent Western imperialism at the moment, with the invasions of Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, bombings in Iraq, etc., it's a very difficult time actually to counter this narrative when you have this very strong Western interference, which has already damaged the region, devastated the region, especially in Iraq. So this is countering that. I'm talking about the context of Iraq. Women activists in Iraq, they really need to define what feminism is for them. They need to see what terms they can use that resonate with the communities they're working with. Exactly. They've adopted their own feminism. Feminism is not a Western concept for them. Feminism is something that they practice, that they promote, that they advocate for. But there's still this disconnect between perception and reality. And that's something I think that women activists and women organizations in Iraq are really, really working on. And they're very strong, they're very vibrant, they're not giving up. Mm-hmm. Amidst all the backlash that they've experienced, I would say when I speak to them still, they are more than ever not going to back down. They have already achieved a lot, and they're not going to be disappearing. They're not going to be giving in to the violence and intimidation that they've been experiencing.
And that's something that we've also noticed from EUC research, right? That the civil society actors around the world have incredible resilience and ingenuity in difficult contexts and even working with limited resources. But what strategies and best practice can civil society actors in global majority countries adopt, in your opinion, in their attempts to achieve this gender justice that we are talking about and confront the anti-rights movements?
I think this is where I'm actually uncomfortable at times, Clarice, because what I said earlier as well is that it's the other way around, I think. It's where feminist peace activists we've worked with, it's where gender equality activists we've worked with have decades of experience of working in a context in which they're very much under threat, in which are very much under backlash, and in which we have a very humble position to learn and to see what does that actually mean. So for me, taking up from next week on a role of MenEngage Europe Director, it's where I am very aware that in a European context, we've seen decades of a trend of pursuing gender equality with increasing civic space, with increasing success in changing policies and legislation. And I think we're as a group of civil society actors and activists, gender equality activists, very much faced with the struggle of how do we, in a context of backlash now, which is relatively new to us, deal with this. And so I think what I said in my previous answer was some of those lessons learned that was coming up, and I think that's an approach that both within MenEngage as well as other NGOs is coming to the forefront. It's where we're not doing capacity building. We're looking at how can we bridge knowledge, how can we find spaces and create spaces in which coalitions can be built, in which we can really together become stronger. And try to stay away from competition, try to really learn from each other. And how are we dealing with this? Because the root of our governance is getting attacked in the global minority in North America and Europe. If I'm looking at what that means, like that's I think something to mention first, kind of the scale that we're looking at, and then maybe to go back into some of the ways we can really address it. Between 2019 and 2023, we saw a 1.1 billion euro investment by this whole network coalition of anti-rights groups transnationally happening, which very effectively saw a rise of anti-gender campaigning, registered organizations, and repression towards gender equality activists. We've seen anti-gender parties grow in the European Parliament, and really like restrictive policies and laws slowly coming into play around SRHR, abortion, LGBTQIA plus groups, the framing in which that happens. And I think Florence really pointed to it so well. If we look at what is actually taking shape in a young man's life in a European context, where their access to like the ways that they can access particular information on social media warps their sense of self and warps what they see as being a good man, being a real man. It's very directly increasing levels of violence and very much also detrimental to themselves and those that are around them. And we've sometimes said it to each other, Florence and I, in which we said it's our sons that might have more conservative opinions than our grandfathers on gender equality, where our daughters are in a way being educated, also in the media, also through social media, to be more feminist than the previous generations have been. So there is a real tension there, and it's playing out politically. And I think
it's not just an inkling. Like LSE, the London School of Economics, they did a research I think in 2024, and they did find that I think it was 14-year-old boys are more likely to have misogynistic views than 60-year-old men, and 14-year-old girls are more likely than ever to be feminists. So there's also been other research done. The divide between young boys and girls is just growing, and that's really frightening because they are the future, right? They are the generation that is going to shape the world that we're going to live in. And if they're becoming more and more divided, how can we create spaces where they can understand each other more? I think it's really important. Sorry to interrupt you, but
but that's to underline it for sure. Yeah. And I think what we get to is that these spaces that Florence mentions are crucial. How can we create spaces in which care and empathy is practiced, in which we are working with young men, young boys, to open up their thinking on what does this world that we live in ask of us? What type of roles and norms, and how can we find ways to actually experience our emotions and talk about these, and what role do I want to play? And this is work that happens by many organizations across the world. And we've had experience with Abad, which is a Lebanese gender platform that has worked with us across Southwest Asia. That's also part of MenEngage. That's working very much on creating spaces, safe and brave spaces, for boys and young men to come together to really talk about what is the effect that the pressures of society have on you. If you're in a situation that you can't live up to what you think is the ideal, there's a strong hierarchy to it. There's not many that can reach it. And I think in Manosphere talk, they're talking high value men and what it requires to be that high value men. And they're selling something that can never be reached. And in the meantime, they're making a lot of money on the backs of very increasingly unhappy and disgruntled young men. And I think what is interesting in that is that the ways in which MenEngage organizations across Europe are engaging with it is to create spaces for sexuality education, for discussions on mental health, for talking about care as a central part of how we can be together in a way. And it's all about being smart with creative media, with working with influencers that are already reaching larger numbers of boys and young men at secondary education, tertiary education, and trying to really create groups in which men come together, in which you have not in a digital space alone, but also really a physical connection and camaraderie and open and brave spaces to really talk about this and explore it, and then become increasingly vocal about it. An organization here in the Netherlands called Emancipator uses a triangle where, in a way, the locker room talk that we all know about, that is also banded about in Signal and WhatsApp groups with mostly male friendship groups, can be misogynistic, actually builds up to a reality, also here in the Netherlands, of femicide. So each 8 days, a woman or a young woman is killed by their partner, their ex-partner often. And that's also then connected to what Florence said about what actually happens when those increasingly misogynistic views are clashing with a reality in which young women have more and more space to make decisions on their own lives. And they call it the Nordic paradox, where although in society we see a slow increase of gender equality, we also have seen an increase of femicides. And that's very much connected to that's kind of divergence that's happening. So there's a real need for men to emancipate, to find their own spaces, to open up that man box that's suffocating them. Because we see a higher level of men committing suicide than women. We see this. These are real struggles that we see. And at the same time, if I'm looking at it from a political perspective, with the MenEngage Alliance, there's a real need to find allies at the European Parliament, at the Council of Europe, to see what can we open up further and what type of policies can we put in place and support mechanisms to open up these spaces further and to educate, to be aware of where does some of this violence, this systematic violence come from? Where in a way can we see the manosphere as a real important indicator to potential security issues that our societies will face? And then letting go of kind of hard security, soft security understandings. Increased gender inequality makes us all more unsafe. And although for some politicians it doesn't get you to vote, it's the most crucial thing to advocate for. So I think that there's real important work happening, and it happens across the world. And I think, the ball is in our courts at the European level.
Thank you so much, Ilse and Florence, for sharing your experiences until now. Before we let you go, we have just one more thing for you. Do you have any final message or thoughts? First you, Florence, and then Ilse.
I just wanted to add one thing that came to my mind when Ilse was speaking. I read something the other day, and I've tried to fact check it, but I haven't been able to. But I think anyway, I will just say it. Apparently in 2025, it was searched on Google, how to kill a woman without leaving a trace, over 100 million times. I've tried this claim has been on multiple different platforms and news sites, but I think that in itself says a lot about the current femicide. It's a global problem. It's not a Netherlands problem. It's not an Iraq problem. It's not a UK problem. It's really a global problem. In the UK, it's every 3 days a woman is killed by a man, whether it's an intimate partner or just a man. But I think also it's good to note that men are also the biggest risks to men. Suicide is a huge problem among young men. It's actually the men themselves are their biggest threat, actually. Suicide is one of the leading causes of young men in the minority world. So I think we need to also we need to reframe this as not women being killed, but men are killing women and men are killing men. Yeah, I think if this was reversed and it was women killing this amount of men, we'd be in a very different discussion right now. And I think the world would be reacting in a very, very, very different way. It's not being taken seriously, and I think it really needs to be taken more seriously. We need to listen to women's activists, women's rights organizations, gender equality organizations, trans groups, LGBTQI groups. We need to hear from them what works, work with them, and we need to start working with young men and boys. We need to rewrite this narrative. We need to rewrite what different roles men and boys can play in society to make them feel like they're not powerless. I think there's a lot of work to do. I think we're in a really frightening time. But I'm confident that the women's movement and the growing feminist movement with male allies is growing. And I hope that in the future, the boys that all three of us are raising are going to be modeling different types of masculinity that are not so widely accepted now.
Fingers crossed, and I hope so too. What about you, Ilse?
Such a rousing speech, Florence. I just want to say absolute in support of what Florence just said. It's a simple but very powerful thing to say that if we cannot be free if others are not free. So there is a direct interconnectedness to us, and we know that when authoritarian leaders are starting to target the more marginalized and oppressed groups, we need to stand in solidarity to them. Solidarity at this point is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And I think we need to really understand that the gender rollback and anti-rights agendas, which are strategic and politically, globally funded and connected, are completely connected to the pressure on democracy. So when analysts are analyzing what is happening with Trump's regime in undermining democratic institutions, they cannot talk about that in one way without mentioning what in their strategy they're doing to human rights, to the rights of migrants, to women's rights. These are all connected. We are still working against legacies of patriarchy, of racism, of white supremacy, of colonialism, and all these ideas are directly reinforcing each other. So from a MenEngage perspective, we work on what Florence described so well, engaging men and boys towards a future that is more open and more peaceful, more care-centered and empathetic. And that's something that really needs the solidarity and support and coalition building around the world. And it is really a time to rise and to make a decision on where you want to stand and what you want to do. And small actions can really matter. And anytime you take an action, you're starting to practice your activist muscle, and you're starting to make friends, and you're starting to find ways, and it's exciting and energizing, and you will learn so much. And in the meantime, you will make a real difference. So that's maybe my final call. Do something. Think about, what are you going to do today? What are you going to do this week? What might you do this month? Small actions. Little steps.
Do something. Yes. Thank you so much, Ilse and Florence, for taking out time to share your thoughts, your perspectives, and your experience as well. It was such an enriching conversation with you both. I hardly saw the time go by. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to you out there as well, we say thank you for taking out time to listen to this conversation. And that's all for this episode of our podcast. And thanks again to Florence and Ilse and to you all for tuning in. If you would like to find out more about the EUC project, read our latest reports, or subscribe to Country Alerts, please visit the EUC website, the link to which can be found in the description of this podcast episode. Don't forget to share this episode as well and join the conversation using the hashtag EUC. And until next time, take care of yourselves, stay informed, do something in Ilse's voice, and keep your voices heard across the world. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
EUC.